a real world object, either animated or non-animated, that can be easily identified. Instance is nothing but at particular time what data we are putting, that is called as entity instant. It serves as a template. Entity type describe the set of entities that have a same attribute, but each entity has its own value. Hello everyone, welcome back to one more session of Database Management System, Unit 1, Session 4. Myself, Indu J, Faculty of Computer Science Department, Vidhyaashram First Aid College, Temple of Excellence, MYSURU. Let's today discuss about ER model. What is ER model? How we are going to represent this in the form of diagram, and what all entities, that all we are going to discuss in today's session. Okay, ER model concepts. What is ER model? ER model stands for Entity Relation Model. As name itself indicates, what we are providing? We are providing the relationship between the entities. Now, this is a high-level data model. It is known as high-level data model because this model used to define the data elements and then the relationship of those data elements. Okay, it develops a conceptual design for the database. It develops a very simple and easy design view of the data. Why it is called as a high-level data model? Because it develops a very simple and easy view design for the database. Okay, ER modeling, the database structure is portrayed as a diagram called Entity Relationship Diagram. We call it as ER diagram. Okay, how we are portraying the relationship between each entity? We are portraying using one diagrammatic representation. So that is called as ER diagram or entity relationship diagram. Now, so many times I am telling you entity relationship. Let's see what is entity now. Okay, what is entity? Entity is a real world object, either animated or non-animated, that can be easily identified. What is entity? Entity is nothing but a object. Consider this is pen is object, this remote is an object, whatever we have in this particular room is everything as an object. If we say it is an object, each object has its own properties. Okay, each object describe itself, right, how it should be, what all the properties, how it should look like, everything, what the purpose of that object. For example, if I take this pen, what is the purpose of pen? To write. If I take the fan, what is the purpose of fan? To give the wind, right? Similarly, each and every object has a purpose and its properties. Okay, so the entity may be an object with the physical existence, or entity may be an object with the conceptual existence. We can see the object or we cannot see the object. Physical existence means what? We can touch, feel and see the things. That is called as physical existence. Conceptual means we are assuming something is there, some object is there. That is a conceptual existence. For example, in the school database, the student, teacher, class and course are offered. What all these? These are all the physical entities or the physical object. A student, we can see the student, we can see the teacher, we can see the classrooms. These are all the physical entity. When it comes to the conceptual, we can give an example of bank account number. Okay, we know there exists one object called bank account number, but physically it does not exist. Okay, conceptually it is exist. You can have all the transaction of the banks, your transaction detail, everything that will be provided. So that is a conceptual view or conceptual object we can consider. Next, what we have is in the ER entity, entity can be divided into two types. Entity can be classified into two types depending on the physical existence and the conceptual existence. Okay, tangible entity and intangible entity. What is tangible entity means? The entities which exist in the real world, which has a physical existence, is called as a tangible entity. Object which has a physical existence is called as tangible object. Here, with respect to the database, we call it as entity. That's it. Okay. When it comes to the intangible entity is what? The entity or the object which does not have the physical existence. No physical existence will be there. That's what I have given you the example of bank account number, right? So this is a type of entity what we have. So keep in mind that, dear students, type of entities are different. There are two types of entity. One is tangible and intangible entity. Now we are going to discuss what? Entity type. Okay, both are different things. Keep in mind that. What is entity type? Entity type describe the set of entities that have a same attribute, but each entity has its own value. What it is? It is a set of attributes. Attribute is nothing but set of properties. Properties of particular object, we refer here it as an attribute. Okay. So what is entity type? It will describe a set of entities, set of objects together in the same attribute. Okay. And it has attribute should have the value. Each entity type in the database is described by the name and then the attribute. Each entity type should have its own name and it should have its own attributes. It should have its own properties. Okay, for example, 1 to 2 data in the database, each of them describe the same collection of attribute. If a student is in a database, I cannot get someone else who is employed somewhere into the student database. He comes into the employee database. That is what they are trying to say, that we should have same set of attributes. We should not differ from that particular database. Entity type, and an entity type serves as a template for collection of entity instance. Instance is nothing but at particular time what data we are putting, that is called as entity instance. It serves as a template. Template means how we have to put the data, that will be given by entity type. And an entity type is similar to the class in the object oriented program. All of you studied object oriented programming, right? The basic thing what we have in object oriented programming is object and then the class. Here object is referred as an entity and entity type is referred as a class. What is class? Class is a collection of object. Similarly, entity type is a collection of entities. Okay, ER diagram, each entity type is denoted by rectangle. How we are going to denote in the ER diagram? We are denoting using the rectangle, entity type. Next, we are going to have different types of entity type. How many types of entity types are there? Two types of entity types. One is strong entity and weak entity. Let's see one by one what is strong entity and what is weak entity. Okay, when it comes to the strong entity, are those entities type which has a key attribute. What is key attribute now? The attribute which has a unique value is called as key attribute, and that attribute specify the entity type. Okay, the primary key helps in identifying the each entity uniquely. Why we are using key attribute? To identify each entity uniquely, we are using the key attributes. Then it's represented by the rectangle. Again, in the above example, role ID identifies each element of the table uniquely. You can take the student database. Student means what all the properties student should have: its roll number, his name, his age, his mobile number and gender. You can have many more attributes. Now we have described the student with only these attributes. Okay, here you can say how we are going to identify the student. What is the unique value student have? That is the USN. So, or the roll number. This is a unique value what every student has. Roll number does not repeat for other students, but name can repeat. So, name cannot be a unique value. So, roll number is a unique value. Complete agenda of this is to say what is a strong entity type. Entity type, this is an entity type which has a key attribute. Which has a key attribute that will be called as a strong entity. Hope all of you understood that. What is strong entity? Then one more type what we have is weak entity. What is weak entity? Opposite of strong entity, right? Weak entity does not have its unique key or key attribute. That is considered as weak entity, and this weak entity always depends on the strong entity to fetch any data from the database. Okay, so here the statement says that it does not have a key attribute. Weak entity type cannot be identified on its own. It depends on the strong entity to have the distinct value. For example, they have given here, there can be children only if the parent exists. Children depends on whom? Children depends on parents. Here children is a weak entity, parent is a strong entity. Okay, next, in an example of both weak and strong entity, customer. Any customer who goes to any shop, they'll take the customer details. Okay, what all they are taking as in a customer detail? Customer ID, customer name, customer mobile number, gender, and then the age. These are all what? Attribute to the customer entity type. Okay, how the customer will be identified? Does customer will be identified by his name? No, many customer can have the same name. So it is difficult to identify one customer using the name. But we can identify the customer using the customer ID. No, because it is a unique value for each customer. So it is called as strong entity type. Fine. Which is a strong entity type here? Customer is a strong entity type. Then it is a weak entity type. Why we call it as weak entity type? Because address depends on the customer. Why address depends on the customer? Say we have two customers, customer C1 and the customer C2. I cannot fetch the address of customer C2 by going to the customer C1, right? You can have to fetch the address of C1 using the C1 customer ID only. So this is a strong entity and this is a weak entity. Fine. Next we are going to deal with the entity set. What is entity set? Now we have discussed what is entity, what is entity type, and now we are going to discuss what is entity set. Entity set is a collection of entity. Okay, whatever the skeleton we have drawn or the framework we have given in the entity type, for that framework we are putting the values into it. That is the entity set. Let's go with the definition. The entity set is a collection of all entities of a particular type that exist in the database. Entity set is a collection of similar type of entities. Let me explain you with this example. Here what we have is employee. As we have seen in the previous example, what is employee? Employee is a strong entity type, right? How many attributes employee has having? Name, age, and salary. These are all the properties of employee. Like employee in name is what? This is a entity type. Employee is what? Entity type. And whatever the values we are giving here in that particular name, age, and salary, this is completely considered as entity set. Example, entity set need not to be a disjoint. It is not different from the entity type. Whenever you have an entity type, then only you can give the entity set. Okay. Next what we have is attribute. What is attribute? We have already defined what is attribute. Attribute is nothing but the property of the object. Okay, attributes are the properties which define the entity type. For example, student, how we are defining the student? Using the roll number, using the name, using date of birth, age, address, mobile number. These are all the attributes of the entity type student. Clear? How we are going to represent that in the diagrammatic form? Attributes will be represented using the vowel. That is, by using this representation, we are going to represent the attribute in the ER diagram. Entities are represented by means of their properties called attribute. As every attribute has its own value. For example, a student entity may have the name, class, and the age as a attribute. Okay. Here we can see the example. Again, we have more than 2 different types of attribute. Let's see what are the types of attribute. We have a simple attribute. Simple attribute means attribute having the value. That is called as simple attribute. Okay, nothing more to explain in that. An example, student phone number is an atomic value of 10 digit. Okay, phone number is a simple attribute, we can say. Simple attributes are the atomic value which cannot be divided further. We are not able to divide further. We cannot divide the phone number, right? So phone number of 10 digit, it should be 10 digit. If one number misses, it will go to some other person. So that is why they have given the example of phone number. It has an atomic value, a single value, that is called as simple entity. Then what we have is composite attribute. What do you mean by composite? Combining of different things, that is called as composition. In attribute, we are combining different things. A attribute that composed of many other attributes is known as composite attribute. Combining different attribute, we are forming one attribute, that is called as composite attribute. Here you can see the example of composite attribute. Name is one attribute, right? Name is one attribute. We can divide that name into different attributes again, right? So that is a composite attribute. One is first name, middle name and last name. Similarly, we can divide the address also. So address can also be a composite attribute. Next type of attribute is derived attribute. What do you mean by derived attribute? Attribute that is deriving from some other attribute that is existed in the entity type. Derived attribute does not exist in the entity type directly. We are deriving that attribute by using some other attribute, that is called as derived attribute. An attribute that can be derived from other attribute is known as a derived attribute. Derived attributes are the attributes that does not exist physically in the database, but the value of the derived attributes can be fetched from the other attributes that is present in the database. Okay, for example, what we have seen here, the student is a what? Entity type. Student is what? Entity type. What all the attributes student have? Student have roll number as a first attribute, name as a second attribute, birthday as a third attribute. Okay, what about this age? Age is derived from this birth date. So, we can calculate the age of the student using his date of birth. So, that is called as derived attribute. Okay. Next, what we have is single value attribute and multi-value attribute. What you mean by single value attribute? Attribute having only one value with it. For example, roll number, only one value. We cannot give two roll number to the student. That is single value attribute. Single value attribute contain the single value. For example, social security number, or I can say Aadhaar number, passport number, okay, these are all having single, a unique value which cannot be replaced. See, those type of attributes are called single value attribute. Now, what is multi-value attribute? Attribute can have more than one value. For example, your phone number. One person can have two or more phone numbers. Okay, that is called as multi-valued attribute. Here, they have explained the multi-valued attribute. For example, a person can have more than one phone number, email addresses, etc. What all the multi-value attribute examples are? Phone number and then the email. Here you can see the name is given with the John Smith, which is a single value. Address given with the single value. Age is given with the single value. But it comes to the phone number, you can give some more phone number here. Okay, that is called as multi-value attribute. When we are representing this multi-value attribute in the form of diagram, they uses double oval. Okay, they uses double oval to represent, that is a multi-valued attribute. Then what we have is key attribute. What is key attribute? Attribute which is having unique value and will be used to identify the records of the particular database. That is called as key attribute. And an entity type has an attribute whose value is distinct from each individual entity in the entity set is called a key attribute. Again, in the key attributes are the collection of attributes that uniquely identify the entities among the entity set. Entity set, we say it as table. Okay, entity set we also consider it as table because database represented in the form of tables. Okay, its value can be used to identify each entity uniquely. Example, name attribute is a key attribute of the company entity type. A company should have only one name. It can have different franchises, but company name should be one. The same company name, if other person is using for his company, this first person can sue him. Okay, because he has all the copyrights of that particular name. So that's what you are telling. It is a key attribute for the company, that is company name. Next, we are going to say the different types of key attributes. Okay, what are the different types of key attributes? We have primary key. In key attributes, again we are dividing those key attributes into different types. First one is primary key. A primary key is one of the candidate key chosen by the database designer to uniquely identify the entity set. Who is going to choose the key attribute or primary key? Database designer is choosing some of the unique value as a key value or primary key. That is called as primary key. Example we have given in the employee table, the ID, employee ID can be the primary key since it is a unique for each employee. In the employee table, we can even select the license number and the passport number as a primary key. Why we are not selecting? The database designer is not selecting license number and the passport number. That is also unique because we are developing the employee database, right? It is easy for the people who are fetching the data from the database to have employee ID as a primary key. Using employee ID, we can fetch all the data of the particular employee. That is all about primary key. Primary key is what? It is also a candidate key having the unique value. Who is going to define which is a primary key? Database designer is going to define which is a primary. Next, what we have is candidate key. What do you mean by candidate key? All the keys which have a unique value falls under the category of candidate key. Like for example, roll number, passport number, Aadhaar number, all these falls under the candidate key because all these are the unique value. We cannot repeat the same Aadhaar number to some other person or some other person Aadhaar number to one more person. Okay, so that is called as candidate key. Candidate key is an attribute or the set of attributes that get uniquely identify tuple. The candidate keys are as strong as a primary key. You can make any candidate key as a primary key. That's what they have given the example. That is social security number. SSN stands for social security number, passport number, license number, Aadhaar number. These are all the unique values for employee. So this all will be considered as candidate key. Okay, keep in mind that primary key should be only one. But candidate key does not have any such restriction. When we say the table is defined by the primary key, there should be only one primary key. We cannot have a two primary key for the same table. Fine, though the values are unique, you should have only one primary key. Next, super key is a combination of primary key and candidate key or candidate key and candidate key. So these combinations will give you the super key. A set of attribute, one or more, that collectively identify an entity in an entity set. Collectively, together identify the entity in the entity set. Means combining two keys together forms the super key. Okay, for example, the above example employee table, employee ID and employee name together forms what? Super key in the employee table. Hence, this is a combination can also be in a key. Super key could be employee ID and employee name, etc. Let's discuss this with the table or with the database. So far what we have taken example as an employee. What is the entity type? This is a employee table. So table name is called as entity type. How many attribute this type has? Entity type has 6 attribute, that is employee ID, employee name, address, passport number, license number and SSN, social security number. Okay, what is this? This is a primary key for the entity type, right? Entity type employee, which is a primary key defined by the database designer. Okay, this is employee ID is a primary key. Then combination of primary key and the other key attribute is a super key. Okay, combination of employee ID and employee name is a super key. Even we can take the combination of employee ID and passport number as a super key, or you can take a combination of employee ID and the license number as a super key. Okay, any combination can be considered as super key. Next, we are going to discuss about domain of an attribute. What do you mean by domain of an attribute? Attribute should be defined with some value, right? Each and every attribute should have its own value. Which data type is defining that value is called as domain attribute. It's as simple as that. The values that are typically specified using the basic data types available in the programming language, such as integer, string, boolean, floating, enumerated types. Whenever we are saying name is an attribute, so whenever we are saying name is an attribute, what data type name will be accepting? It will accepting character data type, right? So this is called as domain of an attribute. When we are specifying the character, we are supposed to specify the length of the character also. How much length of the name should be. Okay. We can take a larger number also. We can keep it for the small number also. So this complete thing is called what? Domain of an attribute. Attribute is defined using some data type is called as domain of attribute. Okay. Next what we have is relationship between the entities. So far we have discussed what is entity, entity type, entity set, attributes, type of attributes, keys, primary key, super key, candidate key, right? Like we have discussed all things. How we are providing the relationship between each entities. Each entity means from one table to the other table or the attribute of one table. That is called as relation. Relationship is a association between two entities. Relationship is what? Association. How they are connected. All the entity, how they are connected, that is called as a relationship. Relationship is used to describe the relation between the entities. For example, we have one entity that is student. We have one more entity that is course. Student is related to course. How? Once student has to enroll into the course, then we provide the relationship between the student and then the course. Any individual who is not enrolled to any course will not be considered as student, right? So this is a enrolled in is a relation that is connecting both student as well as a course. That is what the relationship is. Okay. Next we have the how the relation will be connected. Here one more example, employee is what? Entity type. How this entity type is connected to the one more entity type, that is dependent. How it is connected? Employee has some dependents. Okay. Employee has some dependents. Who are these dependents? Dependents may be father, mother, wife, children. Those are all dependent on whom? Employee. So what is the relation providing? Has dependent on dependent employee. Okay. Next we are going to discuss about the ER diagram. So far we are discussing ER model. In ER model, what all we have discussed, that has to be put it in the diagrammatic form, and how to represent each component of ER model in the diagrammatic form. That will be given in the ER diagrams. So any object, for example entity, attribute of entity, relation set and the attribute of relationship can be represented in ER diagram. What are we are going to represent in the ER diagram? We are going to represent entities, attributes, entity types, relationship between those entities and attribute of those relationship. All can be represented in ER diagram. It is more useful in the database design because database schema changes rarely. Once we have done the design part, that cannot be changed frequently. So it acts as a skeleton for the database design. Okay. So what all the symbols we are going to use in the diagram? As already discussed, rectangle represent what? Entity. Whenever we have to represent any entity in the ER diagram, we are representing that with the rectangle box. So if it is a weak entity, we are representing that with the double rectangle. Double rectangle represents what? Weak entity. How we are providing the relation between one entity to other entity? That is using the diamond shape. That gives the relationship between each entities. Next what we have is identifying relation. What identifying relations we are using? Attribute, how we are going to describe the attribute in the diagram form means oval. Oval form we are represent. What this underline represent here? Underline represent, it is a key attribute, that is especially primary key. Whenever attribute is displayed with the underline, that is called as considered as primary key. Then double oval will represent the multi-valued attribute. And next what we have is composite attribute. This is attribute is derived from different attributes, that is called composite attribute. And when we are providing the relationship, we are also telling how many entities are participating in the relationship. That is called as total participation. Total participation is represented with the double line, and partial participation. Partial participation is represented with the single line, and this is total participation. Then cardinality ratio. Cardinality ratio is nothing but how many people are communicating with how many people. That is coordinating with how many people. That is called as cardinality ratio. That is represented as one employee coordinating with the n number in the entity 2. That is cardinality ratio. Hope all of you understood what is ER modeling and ER diagram. Thank you.